Okay, so I'm going to try to summarize what I am doing in my thesis. I would like to start by mentioning that I attended a course once where an image was shown of the burnt out Grenfell Tower. The course was not about the Grenfell Tower, but it was about how a country or a nation works through national trauma. So they show this image and we were asked to write our impressions and reflections on it. And I took exception to that. I felt very angry that we were being shown that image, and I was trying to articulate in my head, and there were three elements in my objection. First, I felt, I asked myself, do we need an image of the burnt out tower in order to discuss what happened? I didn't feel that we did. Secondly, it seemed like we didn't have a consent from anybody to be looking at that image. Now, this is an important aspect because that's an image of a tower, it's not an image of a person. So what do we mean by consent in that respect? Still, there was something that made one feel uncomfortable about watching, so I feel that consent is relevant. And thirdly, unfortunately, these tragedies tend to happen to vulnerable communities. And that was the case in here. And so we were looking at almost dissecting what had happened to a community. And there were nobody from that community represented in the room. So I felt like I was being implicated in this without my consent. So those were the three very strong objections that I had, which led me to write an article about that experience and change the course of my PhD entirely. So what I am looking at is how should we think about the use of the photographic representation of human suffering? Now, if we think back at my objections, they had to do with using the photographic representation of human tragedy purely merely as means, and there were issues of consent and respect and autonomy as well. If we talk about consent, we need to talk about autonomy, because one would say, or it could be argued that, well, a photograph is not an autonomous being, therefore how could it give any consent? Especially a photograph where no people are being portrayed. So what do we mean by consent in this respect? And now these are issues that lend themselves to an engagement with Kantian materials. And I intend to explore Kantian materials further on in my thesis. Means and ends. Let's see what Kant says. He says that in his groundwork that we should treat the dignity, whether in our person or in the person of others, always at the same time as ends, never merely as means. And for me, this sat at the core of what had happened to me. I felt very much that we were doing something to other people that we would not like done to ourselves. And the title of my thesis, which is The Use of Other People's Pain, reflects Susan Sontag's book regarding the pain of others. Now, the word regarding has two wonderful connotations in one, that to regard something with some esteem, you have some regard for something, but also regard from the French is to observe, to contemplate. So I am not answering her title as such. I am extending the notion, the thought, and I'm wondering if one can extend the Kantian maxim to the photographic representation of human distress. In terms of use, I will also be drawing on the work of other writers, such as Martha Nussbaum, other neo-Kantians like Kirstein. Now, Nussbaum will be very useful to me because she has written about what objectification and instrumentalization means. So we're looking at issues of exploitation as well. So she developed a criteria that can make us think, when is objectification objectionable, because not all use is objectionable. For instance, one of our criteria has the concept of fungibility, which means interchangeability, whether the suffering of one person is the same as the suffering of anybody else. So if I wanted to have a lecture on human suffering, I can go online and pick up any photograph that represents suffering. And I would not like my suffering to be treated in that way. So there are issues there of the justification of why we would use an image of suffering, of human suffering. Also, there are problems around consent, and Kirstein, he talks about plausible consent. I mean, in the image that we were shown, there obviously was no consent. And they did show a video from the BBC archives where some of the survivors were being interviewed. And it seemed to me that they were showing us that as a mode of borrowed consent almost. Like, we cannot talk to the victims, but we know somebody else who did. And that victim or survivor was quite happy to discuss their situation. So maybe it's all right for us to discuss their situation. I'm not convinced by that argument, which was not made explicit in any case. But consent and autonomy, what it means in the context of the photographic representation of human suffering is certainly worth considering. But obviously, at the beginning of any thesis, one wants to define one's terms. And that leads me to my literature review, whereby I tried to look for what the photographic representation of human suffering looked like when it was treated in kind of philosophical terms. But I couldn't find anything along those lines. Obviously, there were books like Susan Sontag's and other writings which mainly focus on aesthetics and the taking of photographs and what they mean, but not so much on use. And use is key for me, particularly vernacular use. So that means that what ordinary people do with photographs, not so much what journalism does with photographs, or of medical photography or ethnographical photography, but what ordinary people do when they go online and they pick a picture and do something around that. That's what I particularly want to focus on. So in the case of the Grenfell Tower image, we had a photograph that was not a person, but it represented human suffering. So I need to look and think, well, what do we mean by the representation, or the photographic representation of human suffering? So that's the lens I tried to have in my review. And of course, it came immediately into the realm of there is very little on that, even in the philosophy journal of philosophy of photography, philosophy of photography. There isn't a great deal on what photographs do when ordinary people use them, or what it means to be represented in an image. Because to be represented means that you end not at your fingertips, but somewhere further away. But where do we end exactly? So one could take the argue further and say that we end at the edge of the world we have created in terms of our language. But that would not be very useful when we want to explore the particular. So on my first discussion, I focus on the ontology of photography, because I need to know whether this thesis, this discussion on whether we have any moral responsibility towards the photographic representation of human suffering, whether that discussion is worth having. And I need to set the groundwork on what we mean by that photographic representation. And that takes me, first of all, to the ontology, the basic question being, well, what is a photograph? And as simple as that question is, it has been very difficult, if not impossible, to answer. I go into that in detail in my first discussion. And towards my second discussion, I will take that into what Brandon called normative pragmatics. I need to know how what humans do around the meaning they give to photographs. And I'm hoping that that's going to allow me to center on what I mean by objectification and instrumentalization of the representation of human suffering in its photographic form, so that I might take it further in terms of what Kant has to offer to illuminate that discussion. Thank you.